My name is Soval Deathworld. I held the rank of Third Wing Auxiliary in the Kesshari war host at the time of the events I am here to describe. I was 22 cycles old. I had served in contested corridors on 4 moons and 2 surface engagements before Varath Crossing, which is to say I was not young in the way the first rotation cadets are young. I had been shot at. I had watched my unit mate Drevath Osselkan bleed out on a cooling transit floor with his hand in mine. I had learned to read the color of smoke from half a kilometer and understand what it meant before the damage report arrived over the tactical link. I say this because I want the tribunal to understand that I am not a witness given to exaggeration or to the dramatizing of ordinary events. I'm a Third Wing Auxiliary who has been in combat, who has seen soldiers break under pressure and soldiers who did not break, who knows the difference between genuine capability and the performance of it. I was not a cadet seeing his first city engagement and mistaking his own fear for evidence of something mythic in the human in front of him. I was an experienced auxiliary. I am telling you now, under formal record, that what I watched happen at Varath Crossing was unlike anything I had seen before or have seen since. The part that was most unlike anything, the part I have thought about every night for the 11 months since the engagement closed, that comes back to me in the half-darkness before sleep the way certain things do when they have not finished being understood, was not the city. It was not the Drath-Vonn. It was not the dead. It was the small human woman with the cargo dolly. I will try to give this in order. Varath Crossing was a transit junction on the third moon of Orvath, a mid-range cargo hub built at the convergence of 3 major freight corridors. Before the Drath-Vonn Ascendancy moved on the moon, it processed roughly 4,000 transit tons of material per standard cycle and housed a mixed civilian population of around 9,000. Freight operators, handlers, mechanics, licensed resellers, and the administrative apparatus that keeps a junction of that size running. None of that exists in its original form now. The city was shelled from orbit in the opening hours of the Ascendancy advance, and what remains is approximately 6 kilometers of rubble, collapsed loading bays, fractured transit tube infrastructure, and the kind of ruins that take shape when industrial architecture comes apart not in a single detonation, but in sequential failures over hours, floors pancaking into floors, support columns bending past yield and giving way in stages. Whole sections of elevated freight trail dropping onto whatever was below them, and then settling further as the weight redistributed through structures that were no longer designed to carry it. The smell of the place, after 7 days of enclosed cooking, was not something any of us had been briefed to expect. The Drath-Vonn did not occupy the ruins in the conventional sense. They moved through them. That is the distinction the war host intelligence summary failed to make, and that failure is what killed the first 3 columns. The Drath-Vonn Ascendancy's warrior caste, the Vath-Rekka, the Bladesworn, are not a species that holds ground the way Kesshari tactical doctrine understands ground holding. They are a species that controls corridors. Their armor is articulated stone gray plate, layered in overlapping segments that allow full rotational movement at the torso and the major limb joints. They wear their crests flat in combat, which compresses their profile and gives them a low, wide silhouette that is easy to mistake for rubble at distance. Their doctrine in ruined urban terrain is to identify the natural movement paths, the routes that any rational tactical unit will follow to move from entry point to objective, and then to modify those routes selectively, leaving only the approaches they control. They collapse certain corridors and leave others open. They do not need to fight every soldier who enters the zone. They need to identify the route the column is taking, let the column commit to it, and then close the entry and exit simultaneously when the column is in the deepest part of the trap. After that, they take their time. This is what happened to column Vethon 1, which went into Varath Crossing on day 2 of the ground engagement. 41 soldiers entered the North Transit Corridor. 11 made it back to the perimeter. The remaining 30 were recovered over the following 4 days from 3 separate collapse sites, most of them in the condition you would expect from a 7-day enclosed casualty with no medical response. Column Vath-Rekka 2 went in on day 4 with double the number and a different entry point. The Drath-Vonn had had 2 additional days to work on the secondary transit corridor and had used the time with the methodical patience that the Vath-Rekka are known for. 63 soldiers entered. 19 came out. The survivors described being routed through a series of passages that felt like free choices, but were not. Every route that appeared open had been opened deliberately, and every route that appeared blocked had been blocked to direct them toward the passage the Vath-Rekka wanted them to use. The column walked through it the way liquid fills a pipe, each choice narrowing the options until there was only one, and at the end of the one there was nothing good. Column Vath-Rekka 3 was the one I heard about in detail from a Kesshari signals officer named Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka, who I later shared a medical billet with while my shoulder was being repaired. He was a careful, precise person, the kind who checks his own accounts twice before speaking, and he told the story without dramatizing it, which is why I believe it. Third column went in with suppression units, combat engineering attached, drone forward sweep preceding the main body by 300 meters. They had studied the exit reports from both previous columns and changed every element of their approach. Different entry point, different route, different time of ingress, engineering confirmation at every junction before the main body moved. They got further than the first 2. They found a route that remained clear all the way to the central junction, the old primary cargo processing hall, which Warhost Command had identified as the key terrain, the site from which they believed the Drath-Vonn were directing their corridor operations. The column was 40 meters from the hall entrance when the floor of the entire block came down, not all at once. In sequence, first the eastern side, then the western, then the north corridor sealed behind them, then the hall entrance itself. The engineering drones had confirmed structural integrity on all of it 90 seconds before the collapse began. The Drath-Vonn had waited for the drones to complete their sweep, then initiated their sequence. The column didn't have 40 meters of open ground anymore. It had a pit with a Vath-Rekka formation waiting on the far side and no way back. 12 survivors from column Vath-Rekka 3. The signals officer was one of them. He got out through a maintenance crawl that was not on any military map, found by accident in the dark when the passage he was trying to hold collapsed behind him, and the wall gave way into something that turned out to be navigable. He did not know what the passage connected to. He moved toward the light until he found an exterior face and dropped 15 meters to a freight loading area and walked south until he hit the perimeter. This is the situation as of day 7 of the ground engagement at Varath Crossing, which is when my unit, 4th Wing, 6th Auxiliary, 16 soldiers and 1 contracted field logistics specialist, was tasked as the lead element of column Vath-Rekka 4. I should record here that being designated the 4th column to attempt a transit route, where 3 previous columns had a combined casualty rate of approximately 85%, is not a comfortable assignment. Our unit commander, Varath Crossing, was a practical and experienced officer who had served in 3 prior system engagements and had no illusions about what we were being sent into. He told us before we moved out that Warhost Intelligence had received fresh imagery, suggesting the Drath-Vonn primary command element had relocated to the transit junction's southern administrative block, not the central hall that 3 columns had died trying to reach, and that if this was confirmed, neutralizing the command element would terminate the Vath-Rekka's corridor control operation across the entire moon. He said the imagery was assessed as high confidence. He said our route was a southern approach, different from all 3 previous entry vectors. He said our attached engineering element had pre-mapped 6 potential corridors through the southern freight district, using every survey source the intelligence division could locate. He also said, without particular emphasis, what everyone in the briefing room was already thinking. that the Drath-Vonn had had 7 days to study the ruins and had demonstrated a consistent ability to anticipate military approach logic with a precision that previous columns had not found a way to counter. He said this the way a good officer says a true thing that must be said before soldiers walk into a city where 3 columns have recently died. He did not say it was suicide. He said what the data showed, and he let us draw our own conclusions. Then he looked at his planning display and said we would move at first light. I want to describe Varath Crossing the way I actually experienced it from inside, because the aerial imagery does not convey it, and the after-action reports do not convey it, and I have found in the 11 months since that when I try to explain what it was like, I have difficulty finding language that is adequate. This is unusual for me. I am, by training and inclination, a precise person. The surveillance feeds show a rubble field with complex sightlines. They do not convey the constant sound of the place, the settling of structures still in the process of failing, the low intermittent groan of metal bent past yield but not yet given way entirely, the percussion of distant sections giving up and coming down somewhere in the interior where nothing can see them. The city was dying in slow motion around us for the entire 8 hours we were inside it, and the dying made noise, and the noise made it very difficult to distinguish the sound of structural failure from the sound of movement. They do not convey the light, which is the particular light of Ovath-Kaz's third moon, a flat, directionless, pale white illumination that comes from the gas giant filling most of the sky above the overcast. There are no shadows in that light. Everything exists at the same visual distance. A wall at 10 meters and a wall at 40 meters look equally present, equally close, and depth judgment becomes a thing you have to think about rather than a thing that happens automatically. After 4 hours in the city, I had developed a mild headache from the continuous effort of compensating for it. The smell, as I mentioned, industrial chemical, old carbon, and something underneath those that had been developing in enclosed spaces for 7 days, and that I will not describe further. We entered from the southern transit approach at 0630 local reckoning. The engineering drones went in 6 minutes ahead of us, sweeping the first 300 meters of the designated primary corridor. The signals came back clean, no tripwires, no pressure signatures, no excavation disturbance consistent with deliberate structural preparation. We moved in single file at 4-meter spacing, Vath-Vath-Rekka at the forward position, 4 fire teams distributed along the column body, the engineering personnel at the rear with the heavy kit. We made it 340 meters before the lead fire team stopped. Not because of contact, not because of a threat signal from the drone sweep, because of what was in the corridor. There was a cargo dolly parked against the left-hand wall, a standard civilian freight dolly, the medium-capacity model, rated for 400 kilos loaded, with the orange handling frame and the adjustable tie-down rails along the platform sides. It was loaded. There were 3 shapes on the platform, secured under a thermal covering, and as the lead fire team spread into cover positions along the corridor walls, I moved forward to see what Vath-Vath-Rekka was looking at. The shapes under the thermal covering were Kesshari soldiers. They were alive. The closest one, I found out later his name was Drath-Vonn Vath, a signals specialist from column Vathon 3, turned his head when he heard us approach and said something that was so quiet and so blurred by dehydration and exposure that I could not parse the words. But he turned his head and his eyes were tracking and his hand moved. He was alive. The dolly was not abandoned. It was in mid-transit. Someone had set it down against the wall. The dolly had a standard locking wheel brake civilian freight equipment, and that someone was 12 meters ahead of us, standing at the junction of 2 freight corridors, studying the wall. I thought at first she was one of the junction's original civilian inhabitants, someone who had been hiding in the ruins since the initial shelling. She looked the part. Small, under the average Kesshari height, though I understood much later this was a human baseline, rather than an individual characteristic roughly 1.6 meters standing. wearing a gray work coverall that had been gray at some earlier point, and was now primarily a record of the past 7 days rendered in layers of dust and carbon scoring and dried material I did not examine closely. Her hair was dark and cropped short in a functional style, matted against the left side of her face where it appeared she had been sleeping against rough material. She carried a field pack on her back, standard civilian contractor configuration, the kind used by logistics personnel who need to keep both hands available, and she held a tablet in her left hand. Her right hand was flat against the wall, pressing against it the way you might check a surface for heat or vibration. She did not turn when we moved up behind her. She said, without turning, in a voice that was level and slightly rough from sustained low-water use, "You're the 4th column." Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka said, "Identify yourself." She turned around then. She had a long dried scratch along the left side of her jaw, flacking at the edges. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been doing a complicated and demanding job for a long time and has just been interrupted by an administrative question they will have to answer before they can get back to the job. She said, "Eda Voss, contracted freight operator, Voskal Independent Logistics. My contracting entity holds a licensed transit permit for the Varath Crossing Junction Freight Network, permit series V4417 through V4419. I had a cargo run through the Central District staging area when the initial shelling started 7 days ago. I have been moving stock." She glanced past him at the dolly against the wall, a brief inventory check. "Those 3 are from your 3rd column. There are 2 more in the secondary staging bay behind me. The injured ones I couldn't load. I made them as comfortable as I could and I've been checking on them. The ones I could not keep alive I placed where they could be found and recovered." Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka looked at her. He is not a large person by Kesshari standards, mid-height, lean build, the kind of officer who carries authority in how he is still rather than in physical mass. He was still now. He said, "You have been in the city for 7 days." She said, "Yes." He said, "Alone?" She said, "There was a maintenance technician for the first 2 days. His name was Avathsek Ven. He found a sealed storage bay in the Eastern Freight District and decided it was the better option. I understand that decision. He had good water supply in the bay and the structure was sound." She looked back at the wall she had been studying. "I needed to finish my delivery." What I watched on Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka's face in the seconds after she said this was not skepticism. He was a practical officer, and practical officers do not disbelieve things that are standing in front of them. What I watched was the fast, quiet work of recalibration, updating an operating picture against information that does not fit the operating picture's existing categories. 3 columns had gone into this city and mostly not come back. This woman had been in the same space for 7 days and appeared to have been moving through it with enough freedom to collect survivors from 2 different columns and maintain awareness of their condition over multiple days. That was data. Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka was a good enough officer to take data seriously, even when, especially when, it arrived in a form he had not expected. He said, "What's your exit route?" She looked at her tablet. "I can give you that in approximately 4 minutes. I'm checking a wall." She turned back to the wall and pressed her hand against the surface again. He let her. I learned the logic of her route in pieces over the next several hours, partly from watching how she moved and made decisions, and partly from the quiet exchanges she had with Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka and with our attached engineering personnel as we progressed. The condensed account is as follows. Eda Voss knew Varath Crossing in a way that military maps did not capture. Military maps are made for military purposes. They record transit corridors, structural sightlines, fire lanes, defensive terrain features, the things that matter for movement under fire and the seizure of key ground. They do not record what a freight operator needs to know. A freight operator needs to know the load-bearing paths. She needs to know which routes through a structure can support her cargo weight under sustained use. Her dolly at capacity moved at 450 kilos, and a floor section that would hold an unladen soldier would not necessarily hold a loaded freight dolly on multiple transits. Over however many years she had been running cargo through this junction, she had learned which corridors were reinforced under the freight routes, which sections ran over structural voids, and which ran over solid fill, which access doors in the junction's interior logistics network were rated for industrial load, and which were rated for foot traffic only. She had this knowledge not because she had studied it formally, but because she had spent years not putting her cargo through floors, and floors will teach you their own limits if you pay attention. She knew the freight elevators that serviced the sub-level cargo bays, which ran on separate shafts from the transit elevators that appeared on all public maps of the building. She knew the maintenance corridors, not the ventilation routes that the signals officer from column Vethon 3 had found in the dark, those being upper level and HVAC adjacent and low ceilinged, unsuitable for movement under load, but the heavy industrial maintenance corridors, wide enough for automated cargo handling equipment, floored in reinforced composite rated for repeated heavy load transits, sealed with bulk material doors built for structural fire isolation that operated on mechanical latches rather than electronic systems, and therefore continued to function without grid power. The corridor network that served the freight and logistics operations of the junction. The Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka had spent 7 days mapping every military-relevant route through the ruins of Varath Crossing. They had not mapped the maintenance corridors, because the maintenance corridors did not appear in any military-grade survey of the site. They appeared in the freight operator's licensing documentation, the cargo transit permits, the industrial access registry, the maintenance and facilities records of the junction's operating authority, the administrative layer of the junction's operational paperwork that no military intelligence unit had thought to request, because no military intelligence unit had been planning to move 450 kilos of pharmaceutical supply through a contested urban zone. She had been moving her cargo through the parts of the city that the Drath-Vonn did not know existed, because the Drath-Vonn had studied the same maps that everyone who was not a freight operator would study. I want to be precise that this did not make what she was doing straightforward, because it was not. The maintenance corridor network was not a single continuous passage from the south face of the city to the administrative block. It was a series of sections separated by doors, junctions, and in 2 places by partial collapses that had reduced access points to something that required assessment and sometimes required improvised clearance. The junctions between sections required her to cross through areas of the city that were not covered, and those crossings required her to judge when the Drath-Vonn perimeter positions were oriented elsewhere, and that judgment required observation, and observation required time. She had spent the time, 7 days of it, moving, stopping, watching, moving again, adjusting her route 6 times as the city changed around her, as the Vath-Rekka consolidated their positions after each failed column, as additional structural sections failed and closed routes she had previously relied on, as the columns before ours drew Vath-Rekka attention to the northern and western approaches, and left the southern freight district intermittently lighter than it had been. She found the first 2-column Vethon 3 survivors on day 5. They had made it through the same upper maintenance crawl the signals officer had used for his escape, working their way south in the dark, and had lost their orientation when a section of ceiling dropped behind them and scattered their light sources. She found them in the sublevel near the central junction's eastern freight bay, sitting in the dark and unable to determine which direction south was. She loaded them onto the dolly. She found the 3rd survivor on day 6 in the eastern freight district proper, concussed, unable to walk without support, sitting against a support column eating the last of an emergency ration with the focused concentration of someone who has decided that eating is what they are going to do until something changes. She loaded him too. When Veth Orvenkaz asked her, during the first rest stop in the maintenance corridor, why she had done this, why she had added the weight and the complication of 3 wounded soldiers to a transit she was already making under difficult conditions on her own. She looked at him with the expression that I was already learning to recognize. The expression of someone who has been asked a question that they are not sure they understand. She said they were alive. He waited. She said I had space on the dolly. We moved at what I would describe as deliberate pace, which is not a pace a military column in contested terrain would voluntarily select. Deliberate means slow enough to think. It means stopping for 3 minutes at a junction, while Etta Voss goes 12 meters ahead alone to check something about the floor and comes back and routes us around a section that looked clear because the load rating under our combined mass is not what she needs it to be. It means moving in single file with 4-meter spacing, and then, at her signal, compressing to 2-meter spacing when we are in a section where the corridor narrows and the ceiling has dropped, and she needs us to move as a smaller profile. It means waiting in a sealed maintenance bay for 9 minutes in the dark while she moves ahead to observe a Drath-Vonn position, and coming to terms slowly, during those 9 minutes, with the fact that the reason we are waiting in the dark is not that she is afraid of what is ahead. The waiting was the hardest part for our soldiers, I think. A column in contested urban terrain is trained to move, to maintain momentum and spacing and fire coverage, to present a dynamic profile that is harder to pin and harder to funnel. Standing still in the dark, while a civilian contractor goes ahead to verify something is not in the standard engagement doctrine. Several of the soldiers in my unit, good soldiers, experienced ones, had a quality of controlled discomfort during those waits that I could read in how they held their weapons and where their eyes went. The city was making its constant sounds around us. The Vath-Rekka were out there somewhere, the same Vath-Rekka who had killed 3 columns, and we were standing in the dark waiting for a woman in a gray coverall to come back and tell us we could move 3 meters to the left. She always came back. She came back at the intervals she had estimated. She told us what she had found, and she told us what it meant for the route. She was not verbose about it. She gave the information and the decision, and then she moved, and we followed. There was a cadence to it that developed over the first hour, a rhythm that the column found without being told to find it. She set the tempo and we matched it, and the discomfort of moving at her pace rather than a military pace became, gradually, less like a compromise and more like the correct thing to be doing. I noticed, around the 90-minute mark, that the soldiers who had been holding their weapons with the tightest grip in the early maintenance bays had relaxed incrementally. Not because the situation had changed. The Drath-Vonn were still out there. The city was still failing around us. The stakes were the same as they had been at 0630. But something in the way she moved, the consistency of her judgment, the absence of any gap between what she said and what she did, had created a kind of operating confidence in the column that had not been there before. It was not the confidence of soldiers who believe they will win. It was the more specific confidence of soldiers who have begun to trust their guide. I watched her move for a long time before I found language for what I was watching. The closest I came was this. She moved like someone doing a job they have done many times. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the precise economy of someone who has learned exactly what each action requires, and does not spend more than that. She pushed the dolly with one hand when the corridor was straight, 2 hands when she was managing a turn or navigating debris, and she adjusted her speed through each floor section with an attentiveness that only became visible when I had been watching long enough to notice the pattern, slightly faster on the reinforced spans, slightly slower on the unsupported sections. The adjustment so small and so consistent that it looked like ordinary variation in her pace. She never checked her tablet for those adjustments. She knew it from having walked these floors more times than she had counted. She checked her tablet for other things. The load rating data when she was deciding whether a new debris field we had not crossed before would hold us. The building layout when she was positioning us relative to where the Drath-Vonn positions had been when she last observed them. The maintenance schematic when she needed to confirm a junction connectivity before committing the column to a route. She used the tablet the way a navigator uses charts, not to tell her what was there, but to confirm what she already expected was there and flag the places where her expectation might be wrong. There was a moment, at roughly the 2-kilometer mark, where the primary maintenance corridor intersected with a section that had partially collapsed. The ceiling had come down on the eastern side and left a passage roughly shoulder width on the western edge, floored in debris that needed to be assessed before any significant weight crossed it. She stopped the column, went forward alone, tested the debris surface in 3 places with her boot with the specific probing patience of someone checking ice, and then came back and said, "Single file, stay against the left wall, no more than 1 person in the section at a time. Wait for the person ahead to clear before you enter." She looked at the dolly. "I'll take the dolly through last. The load distribution is different and I want to watch the surface while everyone else crosses." Vath-Rekka looked at the collapsed section and looked at her and said, "Understood." She sent us through one by one. She stood at the entry of the collapsed section and watched each soldier cross, and she did not move until the last one was through, and then she pushed the dolly in against the left wall and moved through at a pace that was slower than the soldiers had moved, not because she was uncertain, but because the dolly changed her center of mass and changed her contact with the surface, and she was making a different set of calculations. She came through. The floor held. She did not comment on this. We kept moving. Our first contact with the Drath-Vonn came at 2.3 kilometers, in the mid-junction transition zone, the section between the southern freight district and the central hub, where the architecture shifts from wide industrial bays to the tighter commercial grid of the original transit terminus. The ceilings in this section are lower, and the corridors are narrower, which reduces sight distance to about 14 meters in the straight sections, and to the length of your arm around the turns. She had briefed this section to Vath-Rekka before we entered it. There was a stretch of approximately 80 meters, where the maintenance corridor ran parallel to a primary transit corridor, with nothing between them but a load-bearing partition wall, and she had established on day 3 that the Vath-Rekka used the primary corridor as a patrol route. She had timed the rotations from the sound on 2 separate days. We heard the patrol 20 seconds before they passed our position. 11 contacts. By the count of the footfall, the Vath-Rekka in their stone plate articulated armor have a specific weight and rhythm to their movement, a heavy lateral rolling characteristic that is distinct from any other species in the Ascendancy's order of battle, and that I had heard before in other engagements and could identify. 11 of them, moving south to north at a patrol pace, 4 meters on the other side of the partition wall. Nobody moved. Vath-Rekka had his hand up before the first contact sound had finished resolving and the column went still, and the patrol went past us from one end of hearing to the other, and the sound faded into the city's background of settling and groaning, and the slow ongoing business of failure. Etta Voss had stopped the dolly at the first sound of the patrol. She was standing at the push bar with both hands on it, watching the partition wall. Her face was the same face she had been wearing for 2.3 kilometers, attentive still, without particular expression. When the patrol sounds had faded entirely, she waited, not randomly, but counting, under her breath, in the way someone counts who has done the same timing exercise many times before, and then she released the dolly brake and started moving again, and we followed her. I noticed in the silence after the patrol that I had been holding my breath. I checked myself, assessed, resumed. Then I looked at Etta Voss. She was consulting her tablet. At the 2.7 kilometer mark, we passed the 2 additional column Vath-Vonn 3 survivors she had described, the ones she had not been able to load. They were in a secondary staging bay off the main maintenance corridor, a space that had apparently been used to store replacement cargo handling parts before the shelling, and still had several of the original storage shelves intact. She had made them a space between two of the shelves, out of the wind from a fractured ventilation panel, with a thermal sheet and 2 water units from her pack, and the remaining emergency rations from her own supply. One of them, a young Kesshari soldier with a leg injury that had been field dressed with material from the staging bay's cleaning kit, was awake and looked at us with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time without being sure it would arrive. She stopped at the bay long enough to check both of them, confirm their condition with the kind of rapid, practical assessment that field medics use, and that she had apparently developed over the course of the past 2 days. And then she detailed 2 of our column's soldiers to carry them, and adjusted the dolly load, and we moved. I did not ask her how she had learned to assess a leg injury, or how she had known which of the staging bay's materials would serve as a field dressing. I was beginning to understand, by this point, that the questions I kept wanting to ask her would not produce the kinds of answers I was expecting. She had done the things in front of her. She had used what was available. That appeared to be the entire extent of her methodology. The second contact came at 3.1 kilometers, at the last section before the southern administrative block's outer perimeter, the stretch where the maintenance corridor crosses an open freight yard, a roughly 40-meter gap between 2 intact buildings where the elevated freight rail sections had come down in the initial shelling and created a tangled overhead landscape of broken infrastructure. It was the one section of her route that had no structural cover and no ceiling. Open sky above the overcast, the flat pale light of Varath Crossing washing everything equally. She stopped us at the entry to the freight yard and studied the overhead structure for a long time without speaking. I looked up with her. At the far edge of the yard, moving through the collapsed rail sections at a height of perhaps 12 meters, there were 2 Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka scouts in full armor. They were oriented north, watching the approaches from the central district. They were not looking toward us. They were approximately 100 meters from our position. One of them was moving. The other was stationary, positioned at the highest point of the debris, with a field of view that covered most of the yard. She watched them for roughly 40 seconds. She was counting something. I could see the slight movement at her lips. Then she turned to Deathworld Vath-Rekka and said, quietly and precisely, "The stationary one rotates on an approximately 3 to 4 minute interval. The moving one covers the eastern sector and returns to the elevated position every 7 to 8 minutes. There's a sightline gap between that collapsed section at 40 meters and the one at 60, a dead zone in the elevated observer's coverage. If we move in the first 10 seconds after the stationary one rotates, we can be inside the gap before he completes the rotation. The timing window is tight, but it's there. I've crossed this yard twice." Deathworld Vath-Rekka looked at the yard. He looked at the scouts. He looked at the dolly carrying 3 wounded soldiers, and then at the 2 additional soldiers being supported by our column personnel. He did the calculation. He said, "You lead with the dolly. We follow by element, 4-meter spacing, same order as before." She said, "Yes." She watched the stationary scout. I watched her watch him. She had her hands on the push bar of the dolly, and her weight was already slightly forward, already in the posture of someone about to move. The scout rotated. She moved. I want to describe what she looked like crossing that freight yard because I cannot properly explain the recognition reveal at the end of this account without you understanding it. She moved at a pace that was not a run and not a walk, but a controlled speed between them that ate ground without appearing to hurry. The pace of someone who knows exactly how fast they need to move and is moving at exactly that speed and not a fraction more, because speed above what is needed is waste, and waste causes errors. She had both hands on the push bar, and she was steering the dolly through the debris field with micro-adjustments that were too small and too frequent to look like steering, and instead looked like the dolly was simply avoiding obstacles on its own, routing around chunks of rail section and fractured cargo container and broken flooring with the continuous attentiveness of someone reading a surface they know. She was crossing 40 meters of open ground in flat pale daylight, pushing 450 kilos of material and wounded soldiers, in a city that a species specializing in corridor interdiction had spent 7 days optimizing for exactly this kind of exposure. She moved like someone delivering a package on a schedule. We followed, 4-meter spacing, element by element. The stationary scout rotated back at 11 seconds by my count. We were 2/3 of the way across, inside the dead zone she had identified, where the collapsed section at 40 meters blocked the elevated sightline. Vath-Rekka brought the last element through the gap at 14 seconds, and the maintenance bay door was in the building face ahead of us, and she had it open. Mechanical latch. No power required. She had her key for it. Her freight operator access key that still worked because mechanical latches do not care about the grid status of a shelled city. And we were through. On the far side of the door, she set the brake on the dolly. She put her hands on her knees and breathed. Carefully, steadily, 8 counted breaths. This was the only moment in 8 hours of movement through that city that I saw her take something that looked like a moment. I stood in the maintenance bay and watched her, and I thought, not for the first time that morning, about what the city must have looked like to the Drath-Vonn over those 7 days. They had studied the movement patterns of 3 military columns and learned to predict and counter each one. Their operational model was good. It did not have a category for a freight operator with a cargo manifest and 7 years of load route knowledge. It had not needed one before. She straightened up, checked her tablet, and said, 300 meters. The southern administrative block of Varath Crossing had survived the initial shelling largely intact. The Ascendancy had shelled the northern and western structures to create the rubble field that served as their operational environment, and had preserved the southern block deliberately. The Drath-Vonn command element intended to use the administrative infrastructure for their coordination node, and a building that is still standing is more useful for that purpose than one that is not. The preservation worked against them. An intact building has predictable access architecture, and Etta Voss knew the access architecture of the southern administrative block the way she knew every access architecture in the junction. From years of moving cargo through it, from the freight operator documentation that described every entry point rated for industrial load, from the building's maintenance records that she had carried on her tablet as standard freight operator practice since the day she first contracted for a delivery run to the Varath administrative offices. She took us through the loading dock. The southern administrative block had a sub-level loading dock for the building's internal supply and materials operation, the infrastructure that services any large building's day-to-day function, the kind of logistics backbone that is used constantly and thought about by no one except the people responsible for it. The loading dock had a freight elevator rated for 600 kilos. It had a sealed mechanical door to the sub-level service corridor running under the building's eastern wing. It had, critically, a direct connection to the building's internal pneumatic freight system, an older installation from the junction's earlier construction period, superseded in most of its functions by automated handling equipment, but maintained for record transfer between administrative departments and for small package internal logistics. The pneumatic freight system had active terminals on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th floors of the eastern wing. She did not use the pneumatic system to move through the building. She used the mechanical state of its pressure valves. The pneumatic terminals logged their own most recent use in the valve position, a mechanical memory, not an electronic one, not dependent on power, simply the physical state of a valve that was last opened at a particular time. She could read, from the sub-level junction point, which terminals on which floors had been accessed recently. 3rd floor, eastern wing. 2 terminals showing recent access patterns, both within the past 24 hours based on the pressure bleed she could measure at the sub-level. She showed Vath-Rekka on her tablet, the building schematic, the terminal locations, the 3rd floor eastern wing marked as the occupied zone. He studied it for a measured interval. He deployed the column through the freight elevator, sublevel to third floor, in 2 lifts, and we came out of the service corridor into the eastern wing from a direction that the Drath-Vonn had not prepared for. The service corridor was not in any military map of the building. The freight elevator shaft had been assessed as non-functional in the Intelligence Division's structural survey. Non-functional meaning it required operating knowledge of the freight system to run, and the survey team had not had any, and the shaft had appeared to be just another equipment space in a building full of them. I am not authorized to describe the engagement itself in detail in this deposition format. I will say it lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds by Varath Vath's after-action record. I will say we lost 2 soldiers, Sen Vath, who had been with the war host for 9 rotations, and Drath-Vonn, who had been with the wing for 2 rotations, and who I had sat across from at every unit meal for 3 months. I will say the Drath-Vonn command element was neutralized, and the corridor control operation they had been running terminated, as Varath Vath had predicted, within 18 hours as the distributed Vath-Rekka units lost their coordination source. None of that is what I am here to describe. We came out of the southern administrative block through the loading dock, the same way we entered. The column was smaller by 2. We were carrying 5 wounded now. The column Vethon 3 survivors on the dolly, the 2 additional survivors who had been carried from the staging bay, and 2 of our own soldiers who had taken impacts in the engagement and could move under their own power but could not move quickly. We carried Sen Vath. Eda Voss pushed the dolly through the final section of maintenance corridor, and we came out through a ground-level cargo bay door on the southern face of the building, into the light. The war host perimeter was 600 meters south, across the transit approach road. I could see the forward position marker posts, the tactical vehicles, the sensor outposts along the tree line. 600 meters of open ground in the flat pale overcast light of Vath. Vath called the forward position on the tactical link and identified us, gave the survivor count and the wounded status, requested medical response and extraction assistance for the non-ambulatory. The forward position came back immediately. They had been waiting. They had drone coverage of our exit point. They had seen us emerge from the cargo bay door. They had seen something else too. The Drath-Vonn Ascendancy's perimeter coverage of the southern administrative block had not been immediately pulled following the neutralization of the command element. The Vath-Rekka platoon holding the southern transit approach was still in position, approximately 270 meters to our east, in the rubble of what had been the junction's transit authority offices. They had eyes on the cargo bay door before we opened it. They had seen us emerge. 16 soldiers, reduced from 16, plus the wounded, plus the freight operator in the gray coverall pushing the cargo dolly. The forward position advised us of this. They said the Drath-Vonn perimeter element had not moved and had not fired. They said the element had received the signal from the command post going silent, and had remained in position. They said that, as of 40 seconds prior, the senior officer of the Drath-Vonn perimeter element had keyed his communications equipment. He had not called for reinforcement. He had not submitted a fire request. He had not radioed for authorization to engage. He had submitted a species identification query to the Ascendancy's Unified Xenobiological Database. I want to be exact about what a species identification query means in the context of Drath-Vonn Ascendancy tactical communications, because it is material to the substance of this deposition. It is not a targeting protocol. It does not initiate or support a weapons engagement. It is not a hostile contact report. It is a query addressed to the database that the Ascendancy maintains on known sapient species encountered in their operational theater, and it asks, in the formal language of the Ascendancy's military record-keeping, what is this? A Vath-Rekka officer submits this query when he has observed something in his operational environment that he cannot classify against his existing knowledge. It is the query you submit when your categories have run out. The Vath-Rekka commander had been operating in Varath Crossing for 7 days. He had watched 3 Kesshari columns enter and mostly not leave. He had presided over an interdiction operation of high effectiveness against a militarily capable opponent. And then, on the morning of day 7, he had watched something emerge from the southern administrative block of the junction he controlled. The block he had been using as his command post, the block no previous column had reached, and what he had watched had been a small figure in a gray work coverall pushing a cargo dolly with wounded soldiers on it across 600 meters of open approach road in the flat pale light of Orvath Kaz, and he had needed to know what it was. The database returned a result. The species identification query resolved. The Vath-Rekka commander received confirmation that what he had been looking at was a Terran human, Origin World Designation Class 19 Ardenvast, a high-gravity, high-UV, high-atmospheric pressure environment in the outer rim classification bands. Sapient, catalogued as a generalist terrestrial predator with broad environmental adaptation parameters. The record included documented species-level behavioral characteristics, elevated stress tolerance under extended high-stimulus exposure, reduced acute threat response suppression in high-danger environments, high individual behavioral variability under sustained load. I do not know how much of the record he read. I know that the Drath-Vonn perimeter element held position for the entire 600 meters of our withdrawal to the forward line. I know that later, when the engagement closed and the moon was secured, and the Kesshari intelligence analysts were going through the Drath-Vonn command records from the Varath administrative block, they found a notation in the operational ledger of the Southern Perimeter Commander. It was filed in the personal notation field, the field Vath-Rekka officers use for observations that have no formal category in the standard reporting structure. It was entered at the time corresponding to our withdrawal, and it was 3 lines. In translation as accurate as I can render it, Terran human Class 19 origin, single operator, moved through occupied zone for 7 days without loss, extracted 5 enemy survivors, used the freight system architecture, did not engage, did not break, perimeter hold authorized on my authority. The record should show I watched her walk out. I wanted to know what I had been sharing the city with. I have been asked by members of the tribunal in the preliminary proceedings to characterize Edda Voss's conduct at Varath Crossing in terms of the formal categories available to this body. The word that keeps appearing in these discussions is courage, and I understand why. What she did requires a word, and that is the word that exists. I am not certain it is the right word. Courage describes a relationship between a person and fear, and what I observed in Edda Voss over 8 hours of movement through a contested city was not, as I understood it, a relationship between a person and fear. It was the absence of the gap that fear fills. She was not suppressing anything that I could see. She was not managing anything. She was moving through the city, the way she had moved through it for however many years she had been running freight through this junction, applying the same judgment to the same corridors and the same load-bearing floors, doing the job she had contracted to do, which she had not found a reason to stop doing simply because the city had been shelled and occupied, and 3 military columns had died in it. She had a delivery to make. The delivery was pharmaceutical supply. The contract specified delivery to the administrative block's medical storage facility on the 2nd floor, permit series V4419. She made the delivery. I do not know at what point during the engagement she made it. She mentioned it only briefly, in response to a direct question from Veth Orvankaz after the engagement, and she said she had made it on day 4, when she first accessed the building via the sub-level loading dock, and found the 2nd floor medical storage intact and unoccupied. The Drath-Vonn command element was on the 3rd floor. The medical storage was on the 2nd. She had made the delivery and locked the storage behind her and gone back to moving her dolly. At the forward perimeter, after the medical personnel had taken the wounded and the forward position commander had formally logged our column as returned and the count of survivors had been recorded, Deathworld Vath-Rekka turned to her. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Your cargo." She said, "Yes." He said, "You delivered it." She looked at him with that expression, the one that surfaces when a question does not entirely make sense to her, and then she looked toward the medical bays where the column Vethon 3 survivors were being attended to, and she nodded once. A small, practical acknowledgement, the kind a person makes when confirming an obvious fact. Then she asked where the logistics intake office was, because she needed to file her delivery receipt and close the contract. Deathworld Vath-Rekka looked at her for a long moment. Then he pointed her to the administrative billet on the eastern edge of the forward position, and she thanked him and adjusted her field pack and started walking, and she walked across the transit approach road in the flat pale light of Vath-Rekka with her tablet in her hand, and she did not look back. "I am Soval Deathworld, 3rd Wing Auxiliary, Kesshari War Host. I am 22 cycles old. I have served in contested corridors on 4 moons and 2 surface engagements. I watched Etta Voss move through Varath Crossing for 8 hours, and I watched what the Drath-Vonn Vath-Rekka commander did when she walked out of the city he had controlled for 7 days. The tribunal has asked me what I believe the appropriate commendation category is for her service. I believe the appropriate category is the one that does not yet exist. The categories available to this body were written for soldiers, and she was not a soldier. She was a freight operator who had a delivery to make and found in the course of making it that the city was occupied, and 3 military columns had died in it, and there were soldiers alive in the ruins who needed to be somewhere else, and who had the equipment and the knowledge and whatever it is she has in the place where fear would be, and who used all 3 until the job was done. I have thought in the 11 months since Varath Crossing about what the Vath-Rekka commander wrote in his ledger, more than I have thought about almost anything else. He was a professional military officer of a species trained from early development in corridor combat and urban terrain operations, who had been running a highly effective interdiction campaign for 7 days in a highly complex environment, who had the casualty rates of 3 opposing columns to demonstrate his effectiveness. And he watched her walk out of the city he controlled. And the thing he needed to do, the thing his professional apparatus required of him, was to find out what she was. I understand that need. I am here in part because of it. The deposition form asked me what I saw. I have told you what I saw. What I can add beyond the record is this. At no point during 8 hours of movement through Varath Crossing did Etta Voss raise her voice. She did not express impatience, or fear, or urgency, or satisfaction, or any register that I would describe as emotional rather than operational. She expressed attention. She expressed precision. She expressed the particular kind of assurance that belongs to people who have spent a long time getting very good at a specific thing and know exactly how good they are. She moved through a city that 3 military columns had failed to move through, and she brought us out the other side, and then she asked where to file her paperwork. That is what I saw. The category I leave to the tribunal.